Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., where we are talking to Bruce Klingner, who is one of the nation's leading experts on North Korea. Bruce, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Obviously, it's a fascinating time with North Korea. It's always been, there's always a surprise there. You and I have been talking about North Korea for a long time. You've been studying North Korea for almost your entire career. Talk to us a little bit about how the dynamic is changing now. You know, if you look at it, longer generations of long-range missiles, we think that there's not only a miniaturization of the arsenal, but perhaps an easy ability to put those weapons on a rocket. And then you look at somebody who, Mike Green, we talked to a couple of weeks ago, and he said, a guy who's increasingly unstable. You see large-scale purges that are starting to happen, and a guy who we just don't think knows how to pull back from the brink, perhaps like his grandfather or father did. Talk to us about the situation as it stands right now, how dangerous it is, and what are some of the things that we have to do as the United States to try to resolve this?
Well, the Korean Peninsula is always really on the knife edge of a crisis, and as people who serve there have said, is that a tactical problem can become the strategic in the blink of an eye. But right now we really have almost a perfect storm of headaches, threats, crises going on. We have last year a very robust series of missile and nuclear exercises or tests, and they achieved breakthroughs in some of their missiles. The submarine-launched ballistic missile, intermediate range, which can now hit U.S. forces on Guam. And Kim Jong-un has shown that he's willing to continue that, the provocations, the tests, the exercises under the new Trump administration, even as the administration is continuing to conduct its North Korean review. We have Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, saying that they are in the late stages of development of an ICBM, and they'll test anywhere, anytime. Now there are indications that perhaps they'll do another nuclear test. And we had the recent assassination of Kim Jong-un's half-brother using VX, a chemical weapon of mass destruction in a civilian airfield. So the situation is really getting more dire. And we have also increasing advocacy, at least by some, in Washington and Seoul for preemptive military attacks on North Korea to prevent them from acquiring that ICBM technology.
That's a point that Secretary Bill Perry, somebody who's regarded as a strategist many, many years ago, wrote an article, I think with Ash Carter, at the time. The article was written that drew eyebrows like, hey, if we're going to strike, we should strike now before they have this capability. Talk to us a little bit about the problems associated with that, because the statement by Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, was seen by some as a departure of policy, seen by others as not. Talk to us a little bit about the messaging that has to go with this, particularly when we're looking at a leader that may be less stable, less confident, much more insecure than his predecessors.
Well, we're not quite sure how to interpret Secretary Tillerson's comment, just as he, in his confirmation hearings, didn't know how to interpret President Trump's tweet of "it won't happen." Whether the president had drawn a red line, we're not sure. But I put out a paper recently, Save Preemption for Imminent North Korean Attack. So I think there's been a bit too much flippancy in Washington and Seoul over we should intercept a missile in midair, we should begin a bombing campaign to prevent them from developing an ICBM. I think, of course, if you have an inbound missile, whether it's by design or an errant test missile gone awry, of course you intercept that. You protect your sovereignty and your people. Sort of at the other extreme is if you have credible intelligence that you think North Korea is about to attack you, particularly with nuclear weapons, then that's a very difficult decision for the president to decide whether to preempt an attack by starting the attack first. In the middle, I think we should refrain from intercepting a missile in midair if we know it's not a threat, if it's just a test missile. In most cases, we can't intercept it because it would probably be outside of the interception envelope of our missile defense system. But I think it would needlessly redirect world attention and anger away from yet a North Korean provocation towards what at least China and North Korea would depict as a U.S. act of aggression. And the other hand is when people talk about to prevent them from acquiring that capability, we should either bomb the missile on the launch stand, conducting a military attack on North Korea's soil, or a broader campaign to prevent them from developing that technology. Is that missile units, storage facilities, production facilities? That's a very extensive list, which would likely trigger an all-out war on the Korean Peninsula.
And, when it comes to that, what has changed in the last 10 or 15 years about our ability to defend, right? Because if you look at it, Seoul is in the shadow of thousands and thousands of artillery tubes, rocket artillery, and now, nuclear weapons as well. Do we have any sense, first from a defensive standpoint, what's changed? From an offensive standpoint, how dangerous and destructive is North Korea, even in a short conflict with the South?
Well, when I was in the government and participating in war games, the Allied forces would always prevail, but it was always at the cost of an estimated hundreds of thousands of casualties and trillions of dollars of damage. Since then, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons and the missile means to deliver them. Experts will differ, but I think the consensus is that the Nodong medium-range ballistic missile is already nuclear, already has a nuclear warhead. So therefore, South Korea and Japan today are under a nuclear threat. They are continuing to work on their submarine missile, as well as the Musudan intermediate-range missile. They've had successes, they've had failures, they're working on it. The ICBM, again, disagreement amongst experts. We have 4 U.S. 4-star commanders saying they think they have that capability already, or we have to assume for planning purposes. Most outside experts think they're not there yet. They haven't demonstrated a reentry vehicle capability for the ICBM, but clearly that's the path they're on. Probably within a few years, they'll have the ability to hit the continental U.S. with a nuclear weapon.
And how much better are the defensive systems? Obviously, we have, Patriot is over there. We have THAAD being deployed to the region. Talk to us a little bit about how improved the South Korean defensive or the alliance's defensive capabilities are.
Well, of course, they're different threats, and some defensive systems can't protect against the other threats. So right now, the THAAD system that's being deployed, it's better than anything South Korea has or will have for decades. Even their indigenous long-range surface-to-air missile, which won't even be deployed for at least a decade. The THAAD is better than any system they have. So it will add another layer, a more effective layer of defense beyond the Patriot missiles. So the THAAD has a longer and higher interception envelope. That said, the radar can only see in a 90 to 120 degree angle, so it's pointed toward the north, and that leaves South Korea's flanks open to a submarine-launched ballistic missile threat. The missiles that are on South Korean Aegis ships have no anti-ballistic missile capability. They're the SM-2, so they should acquire the SM-6, which would give them a interception capability and protect the west and the east coasts of South Korea. That said, North Korea still has thousands of artillery systems that can hit South Korea or hit Seoul without even moving forward. So there are systems you need, counter-battery radars, perhaps the Iron Dome system from Israel that would better protect South Korea against that.
But the Iron Dome was not designed for mass fires, the likes of which that we would likely see in that context. You've spent a lot of time also thinking about what China should be doing and what other folks in the region should be doing, what the United States should be doing to try to get to a resolution. Obviously, we saw China suspend coal deliveries, but that was a little bit misleading because they'd already hit the coal delivery goal for the year, so they didn't really stop anything that wasn't, they didn't go beyond the letter of the law in that particular case. What leverage does the United States have? Is China ever going to be interested in, applying any leverage to that? And to echo a fear from a Japanese friend of mine, the Japanese fear is that the United States will do a trade deal with China in order to, and then, everybody else becomes incidental to that trade deal, which is sort of a concern that our security could get bargained away, a little bit like Nixon tried to do with Mao when he was doing the opening. What do you think this looks like? What is the levers of power the United States ought to be using? Is it a Banco Delta Asia again, as the Bush administration did, which proved successful in sort of pressuring, North Korea? Obviously, though, with a much more seasoned leader in place in Pyongyang.
Well, China has repeatedly shown itself to be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. They act like North Korea's lawyer in the UN Security Council. They deny evidence. They insist on large loopholes in the UN resolutions. They water down the text that the U.S. and its allies would like to have implemented in resolutions. And we know they turn a blind eye to proliferation occurring on their soil from North Korea, and they only implement sanctions for about 1 to 4 months if you look at the past actions. That said, we can influence the banks and businesses of China to wean them away from engaging with North Korea. So when people say, well, China will never go along with sanctions, i.e. China will never go along with enforcing required UN resolution sanctions. But we can influence the banks and businesses. As you pointed out with Banco Delta Asia, not only was it that specific action, but at the time, U.S. officials went throughout Asia pointing out their susceptibility to sanctions by the U.S. So it led 24 entities, including entire nations and the Bank of China, to cut off North Korea. We know that the Bank of China defied the government of China for their own continued existence, lest they face preclusion from accessing the U.S. financial system. So that same authority, that the vast majority of all international transactions in the world are denominated in dollars, which means they come through U.S. banks, and that includes North Korean transactions. So that gives us actually tremendous leverage that most people don't realize. So we can, if not influence the Chinese government, we can wean away the Chinese entities that are dealing with North Korea.
Nobody knows North Korea well except the people in North Korea, and even the people in North Korea don't know it well. There is a lot of activity. Folks are asking, why did Kim Jong-un kill his stepbrother? That was a succession question. Then the stepbrother he killed, that stepbrother's son said, I'm still alive and I'm still safe, which to some was, is that a signal? How stable is the regime? Is it showing signs of cracking and stress? And could that become a wild card in this calculation that nobody can account for?
The assassination of Kim Jong-nam was bizarre even by North Korean standards. He had been critical of his brother. He had been critical of the second succession, hereditary succession. But that's
which he saw should have gone to him, right?
Well, he said he had no interest in ruling North Korea, and that he thought it was a mistake to pass, again, from Kim Jong-il to any of the sons, power to rule North Korea. That said, he had been quiet for the last several years. He did not seem to be a threat. He was not forming a government in exile. And we know there had been a standing assassination order against him since 2012. So why they decided to act upon it now is a bit unknown. In a way, North Korea has again shot itself in the foot, because just as when the Obama administration was doing its policy review on North Korea in 2009, and North Korea did a long-range missile test and a nuclear test, which caused the administration to adopt a much tougher policy against Pyongyang than it had planned on doing all these missile tests and perhaps an upcoming nuclear test and the assassination using an WMD is only going to harden the Trump administration's policy. Now, as for how firm Kim Jong-un's hold on power is, I think it's actually pretty strong. I think the regime is stable. I think any purges show that he's actually confident enough and secure enough in his hold on power that he can go against even the senior-most leadership. Others will disagree. They see instability, but I think the majority see that the regime is stable.
And what are your top 3 recommendations for the Trump administration as they work to build their strategy to deal with North Korea?
Well, we need to strengthen our defenses and deterrence against the spectrum of the North Korean military threat, and that includes reassuring our allies that while U.S. administrations change, the American commitment and resolve to defend our friends does not. The second is we need to increase the pressure and more fully implement U.S. law, more fully enforce it. The Obama administration talked a good game, but when Obama said North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth, he was flat out wrong. There are things we've done to other nations we had not yet done to North Korea. We really have all the authorities we need. We just need to implement them. So we need to populate the sanctions list, not only on North Korea, but third-party sanctions against Chinese violators. And the third would be that, well, we should hold the door open to diplomacy, diplomat to diplomat. We need to resist the siren song of some who are now advocating freeze negotiations. We've had 8 international agreements to denuclearize. All of them have failed. South Korea has 240 agreements with the North. All of them have failed. We've tried 2-party, 3-party, 4-party, 6-party talks. They've all failed. So we shouldn't just rush back into negotiations, at least until Pyongyang says there's a 1 in a trillion chance they'll denuclearize, because right now they're not even giving us that.
Bruce, thank you so much for taking time with us. It's always a treat. And a special shout out to John Cooper, without whom we could not have made this interview or the one with Dakota. Thanks very much for joining us.